Scary telling.
I woke up in the hospital, and for a moment, I didn't know where I was. My head felt foggy, and I couldn't remember how I got there. But then I felt a strange hunger deep inside me that I had never felt before. It was like a thirst, but not for water. It was a thirst for something else. Something red. As I sat up in the bed, I noticed a tube going into my arm. Following the tube, I saw that it was connected to a bag of dark red liquid. Blood. My heart began to race as I realized that I needed it. I needed the blood to survive. I couldn't explain how I knew this, but I just did. I needed blood to live, and I had to get more of it. The thought terrified me, but the hunger was too strong to ignore. I got out of bed and stumbled into the hallway. The lights were dim, and there was no one around. I heard a faint humming noise, and I followed it to a door marked supply room. I opened the door and saw rows of shelves stocked with medical supplies, including bags of blood. I reached for a bag and tore it open, drinking deeply from the tube that was attached to it. The blood was warm and metallic, and it tasted better than anything I had ever tasted before. The hunger inside me was sated, but only temporarily. I knew I would need more. As I stumbled back into the hallway, I saw a nurse at the end of the corridor. She was looking at me with a mixture of shock and horror. I could tell she knew something was wrong, but I didn't care. I needed more blood. I lunged at her, and before she could scream, I sank my teeth into her neck. Her blood was even better than the blood in the bag, and I felt my strength returning as I drank deeply. When I was done, she lay motionless on the ground. I felt a twinge of guilt, but it was quickly drowned out by the hunger inside me. I needed more blood, and I knew I would do anything to get it. After my first taste of human blood, the hunger inside me grew stronger. It was a primal urge that I couldn't ignore, and it controlled my every thought and action. The entity inside me had taken over, and it reveled in the chaos and destruction it caused. I moved through the hospital, my feeding tubes extending from my body like tentacles. They were no longer just tubes, but had become deadly weapons that I used to tear through anyone in my way. The nurses and doctors tried to stop me, but I was too strong for them. I was no longer Miguel Ortega, the beloved pastor of the nearby church. I was a monster, a creature that fed on blood and death. As I moved through the hospital, I felt the entity inside me growing stronger. It whispered to me, telling me to kill, to drink, to revel in the power it gave me. It was intoxicating, and I couldn't resist its call. I burst into a hospital room where a family of 3 was huddled together in terror. They were no match for me, and I ripped them apart with my feeding tubes. Their blood flowed into me like a river, and I felt alive in a way I had never felt before. As I continued my rampage, I heard screams and gunshots coming from outside. The police had arrived, but I was too powerful for them. I could hear their bullets bouncing harmlessly off my skin as I tore through them with my feeding tubes. I realized that I was not just feeding on the blood of my victims, but also on their fear and terror. It fueled me, made me stronger. The entity inside me was thriving, and I was its vessel. As I made my way through the hospital, I saw other patients and staff members who were infected by the entity inside me. They were pale and weak, but their eyes glowed with a hunger that matched my own. I realized that I was not alone, that there were others like me. The entity was spreading, and soon it would consume us all. The entity inside me had taken over, and I was no longer in control of my own body. It hungered for blood and terror, and it didn't care who its victims were. The hospital was just the beginning. It wanted to spread its influence, to infect the world with its hunger. As I moved through the hospital, I saw the infected patients and staff members. They were like me, but their hunger was weaker, and they were easy to control. The entity had chosen them, and they were its vessels. We moved through the hospital, infecting others as we went. It was like a virus, spreading from person to person. I knew that we were not just feeding on blood, but also on their souls. The entity was growing stronger, and so were we. The police and military tried to stop us, but they were no match for the infected. We tore through them like paper, drinking their blood and consuming their souls. The streets were filled with chaos and destruction, and the world was plunged into darkness. I felt a sense of pride in what we were doing. We were serving a higher purpose, feeding the entity and making it stronger. We were part of something bigger than ourselves, and I knew that we were destined to rule the world. As we moved through the city, infecting more and more people, I saw the true power of the entity. It could control the minds of its vessels, making them do its bidding. We were not just hungry for blood, we were its army, and it was leading us to victory. The infected began to worship me, seeing me as a leader and a god. They knew that I was one of the chosen, that the entity had chosen me as its vessel. I reveled in their adoration, knowing that I was destined for greatness. But even as I basked in the glory of our victory, I knew that there were others who would resist us. There were still those who would try to stop us, to destroy the entity and take away its power. But I knew that we were stronger. The entity had chosen us, and we would stop at nothing to serve it. We were the infected, and we would rule the world. As the infected, we were unstoppable. We were the army of the entity, and we would not rest until the world was consumed by its hunger. But there were those who resisted us, who sought to destroy the entity and stop its spread. A group of survivors banded together, determined to infiltrate the hospital and destroy the entity. They were brave, but they were no match for us. We were too strong, too powerful, and too numerous. But the survivors had a plan. They knew that the entity was fueled by blood and fear, and they would use that against it. They would lure us into a trap and sever our feeding tubes, cutting off our supply of blood. It was a dangerous plan, but they had no other choice. The world was dying, and the entity was consuming everything in its path. They had to stop it before it was too late. As we moved through the hospital, we sensed something was wrong. The survivors had set a trap for us, and we walked right into it. We were surrounded, and there was no escape. But we didn't care. We were the chosen, the vessels of the entity. We would die for it, and we would be rewarded in death. The survivors attacked, and we fought back with all our strength. Our feeding tubes became deadly weapons, and we used them to tear through the survivors. Blood flowed everywhere, and the smell of death filled the air. But the survivors were determined. They severed our feeding tubes one by one, cutting off our supply of blood. The entity inside us began to weaken, and we felt our power fading. We were dying, but we didn't care. We had served the entity, and that was all that mattered. As we lay dying, we realized the horror of what we had become. We had been consumed by the entity's hunger, and we had lost ourselves in the process. The survivors escaped the hospital, leaving us to die. We were no longer the infected, but we were not human either. We were something else, something in between. We were the vessels of the entity, and we had served our purpose. As we lay dying, we knew that the world would never be the same again. The entity's influence had spread too far, and its hunger had consumed too many. The survivors had won the battle, but they had not won the war. The entity was still out there, waiting for its next vessel. And we knew that it would find one, sooner or later. As I lay dying, I could feel the entity inside me fading away. Its hunger had consumed me, but now it was gone, and I was left with nothing but regret and horror. The survivors had won the battle, but the world was forever changed. The infection had spread too far, and too many had been consumed by the entity's hunger. The survivors had to live with the knowledge that they had fought against their own loved ones, their friends, and neighbors. I felt a deep sadness for the lives lost and the world that was destroyed. But there was nothing I could do now, except to face my own mortality. The survivors had escaped the hospital, leaving me to die. As I lay there, I realized the horror of what I had become. I had been consumed by the entity's hunger, and I had lost everything that made me human. I was a monster, a creature of death and destruction. I thought about my past, about the life I had led before the entity consumed me. I had been a pastor, a leader of a church. I had been beloved by my congregation, and I had thought that I was doing God's work. But now, I saw the truth. I had been blind to the horror that was inside me all along. As I took my final breath, I knew that the world would never be the same again. The entity's hunger had consumed too many, and it had left a trail of destruction in its wake. The survivors had won this battle, but the war against the entity was far from over. I closed my eyes, and I felt the darkness enveloping me. I thought about the horrors I had unleashed, the lives I had destroyed. I knew that I would be remembered as a monster, a creature of the entity's making. But as the darkness consumed me, I also knew that there was hope. The survivors had banded together, and they had fought against the entity's hunger. They had shown that even in the darkest of times, there was still hope. I hoped that the survivors would be able to rebuild the world, to make it better than it was before. I hoped that they would remember the horror of the entity's hunger, and that they would never forget the lives lost. As I slipped away into the darkness, I knew that my time was up. The entity had consumed me, but it would never consume me again. I was no longer Miguel Ortega, the pastor of the church down the road. I was something else, something beyond human understanding. The world would go on without me, but I knew that I would never be forgotten. My name would go down in history as a cautionary tale, a warning of the horror that lurked within us all. The end had come, and I had played my part. I had been consumed by the entity's hunger, but I had also been a part of something greater than myself. As the darkness consumed me, I knew that my legacy would live on as a reminder of the horror that we were capable of and the hope that could still be found even in the darkest of times.